The wind at Union Pass roared down the rocky corridor at night like a predator rattling lodgepole pines and gnawing at the fragile bones of the land. A pale moon, their solitary witness, hung low in the sky as June Barrett pressed her back against the rough-hewn door of the freight wagon, her breath ragged and shallow in the cold. She didn't need to see the tracks to know where they led, east always. East, toward a future she had never asked for, and a destiny she could neither outrun nor embrace. She tasted dust old and bitter behind her cracked lips. Her hands, bound with rough hemp, trembled so violently that she wondered if the rope would fray before dawn. The driver's voice, a low bark in the darkness, signaled the wagon's creak forward down the silent gully. Panic swelled in her chest, squeezing her lungs like a vice. June knew the terrain Union Pass had swallowed lives before, longhorns, fur trappers, settlers. But tonight it threatened to claim her whole. She had been left with nothing but the clothes on her back, a faded gray dress stiff with travel, and a shawl once her mother's. Even that had been taken for toilette, tucked away among the belongings of others. She rummaged inside her mind, searching for a spark, a single detail to keep her tethered to the world. The scent of her homeland Meadowview, Indiana, came to her first lilac bushes in spring, the melody of her sister's laughter. But memories flared too sharp, too tender. She swallowed them, folding them away like brittle petals. The driver's rugged silhouette appeared against the moonlit horizon. He stepped down and opened the brakes. The wagon ground to a halt. The wind stilled as if mocking hope itself. Then June felt the snap of rope slackening. She dared to shift, but the driver's boot followed her movement. "Girl," he snarled, dragging her out by the elbows. "Step aside." She stumbled onto hard-packed snow and ice, every joint screaming. She looked up for the first time, really, and saw him broad frame, powder-dark hair, hidden under a tattered black hat face, creased by wind, lined by responsibility and regret. He held a lantern, its glow ineffective against the freeze. They stood at the edge of the wagon. The driver's flicker of torchlight revealed the jagged pass beyond walls of granite and wind-blown ice. Behind them, the freight train waited its boxcars groaning in the cold. Ahead lay darkness. But what no one knew, and what June would cling to like breath, was that the man before her carried his own burden, one too heavy to share with strangers. The driver spat and shrugged. "He'll take her. Figure a beast's price. That's the law of these parts." With that he stomped away and rejoined the train. The lantern shifted. The rugged man, her only audience, met her gaze. June tried to quiet her racing heart. She searched those gray-green eyes and saw sparkles of something she recognized: weariness, empathy stones flicking in a winter creek. She raised one stiff hand. He shifted the lantern, and June read his features by the thin glow. It was enough to shock her back into motion. She snapped at her bonds, ripping at the rope until her hands freed themselves. She felt his breath catch. He said nothing. He didn't move, but he didn't flee. June staggered toward him, web of emotion flooding her: fear, defiance, longing for rescue she didn't yet deserve. Her voice came low, rough as gravel. "Why won't you leave me?" He leaned forward slightly. Wind whipped his coat, but he stared back without flinching. "You're not a horse," he said quietly, his voice thick with something. "You're a woman." That stopped her. She opened her mouth, but the words froze. That one sentence, simple, unyielding, cut deeper than any lash. They stood in that long moment darkness around them, but for the fragile lantern each weighed by their own history. A man who saw worth in a scapegoat. A woman denied worth herself. Then he raised the lantern higher, swung it around, and paused. Beneath the canvas wagon, something shifted, a pair of painted wooden blocks holding her ankles designed to stunt escape. He lifted one with the butt of his boot. June almost fell. The frozen ground bit at her legs. He took a slow step closer, lantern extended. "My name's Cole Thompson." She didn't trust herself to speak. She only repeated it in her mind, "Cole Thompson." He nodded so faintly she might have missed it. "Step away from the wagon." June swallowed against the cold. She fought the urge to collapse. She obeyed. They distanced the length of a man and a woman who do not yet know one another, but who sense that tonight everything begins. At the edge of Union Pass, they stood breathing. The wind waited. The moon watched. He laid the lantern on the snow and reached into his pocket. June braced herself for the flick of handcuffs, the cold metal of some crude iron, the finality of another transaction. But instead, he pulled out a flat leather pouch. He tossed it into the snow. Coins spilled small, and copper caught the lantern glow, 5 silver dollars. They scattered across the ice. June's breath caught. He stepped away, folded his arms, face unreadable. "That's your ticket?" he said, voice low. "I'm not buying your silence or your obedience. Just your freedom." She stared, frozen, where she stood, the coins at her feet a fractured promise. Overhead, the wind turned higher, as if roaring its approval or disbelief. June bent to gather the coins. She counted them in the lantern's light, 5 cold rounds that represented more than money. They were a choice. She looked up. Cole Thompson stood watch, not leaving, not imposing. Just waiting. She straightened, clutching the pouch to her heart before lifting it to him. He shook his head. "You keep it," he said. "The world's better off if you decide what it's worth." June looked at him, and the wind prowled around them, the pass narrowing into an icy throat. And somewhere deep in that gale a question echoed, who was this stranger who paid for a woman he didn't own? She didn't answer. Instead, she slid next to him, uninvited but not unwanted. Together they faced the molten night. She would learn his name. He would learn hers. And somewhere in that darkness, one unspoken truth took root. They needed each other now, not as owners but as equals. The wind screamed, but between them a fragile calm held fast. This was where June Barrett would decide whether to walk forward, into emptiness, into hope, into a story that had only just begun. The trail from Union Pass to Horseshoe Bend was not marked on any official map, but Cole Thompson knew its curves like he knew the ridges of his own palms. The path traced the contours of old migration routes carved not by men, but by elk and wind and centuries of movement. And it was along that trail under the breaking light of morning that he brought June Barrett. She hadn't spoken much since the pass, only murmured once in her sleep as she slumped against him in the saddle, her breath shallow but steady. The fever had crept in sometime near dawn, and now her skin burned under his coat, eyes fluttering open only to close again before words could rise. Her strength, what little remained, had burned bright and fast in Union Pass, and now it flickered low, flickered dangerously. The cabin came into view around a bend in the trees, nestled on a ridge overlooking the bend of the Green River far below. It stood alone, like its builder, square-shouldered and silent pine logs, bleached by wind and sun chimney, leaning like it had stories of its own to tell. Cole dismounted, cradled her carefully in his arms again, and pushed open the door with the side of his boot. Inside was a single room, divided by purpose, a cot against the far wall with woolen blankets folded neatly. A cast-iron stove still warm from his fire the night before. Shelves lined with jars, herbs, and bottles labeled in his careful script. This had been a refuge for years, ever since he left his father's land back in Texas, and found himself lost in Wyoming carrying more regret than cattle. He laid June down, gently brushing a lock of sweat-damp hair from her forehead. She didn't stir. He poured water from a pitcher, soaked a cloth, and pressed it to her neck. Then he did what he hadn't done in years. He began to speak to someone not yet awake. "You're not dying here," he said softly, more to himself than her. "You've come too far." June's fever didn't answer, but her chest rose and fell, faint and rhythmic. Cole set to work. He brewed willow bark tea, mixed a poultice of echinacea and yarrow, and cooled the room by cracking the shutter just enough for breeze to sneak through. Every hour he returned to her side, lifted her gently to sip from a tin cup, whispered words she couldn't hear but might remember in some deep part of herself. The hours stretched into a full day, then another. On the third morning, the sound of a voice not his cut through the quiet. "You're a poor nurse," June rasped, eyes still closed. "You smell like horse." He froze, cup in midair. Then a slow grin broke across his face. "You sound like someone who hasn't died yet." June blinked, wincing at the light. "I don't feel lucky." "That's because you've been sleeping in my bed for 2 days without permission," he said, his tone teasing but warm. "I'd say you owe rent." Her lips twitched into something like a smile, then fell flat again. "Where am I?" "My cabin, near Horseshoe Bend, about 30 miles from Union Pass." He paused, watching her. "You've been very sick. Fever exposure, exhaustion." She tried to sit up, failed. "I should be dead." "You're not," Cole said, rising to pour more tea. "You're stubborn." They said little else that day, but the silence between them shifted from survival to something quieter, something that hummed under the skin. In the following days, June gained strength slowly, like a tree finding root in dry earth. She sat longer by the window, asked questions about the land, about the wildflowers that peeked out through spring snow. Cole answered in the way of solitary men, with precision without flourish. But he always answered. One afternoon, as she sorted herbs from his stores, June asked, "Why all this? Why keep this place, keep these medicines? You a doctor?" "No," Cole replied, setting firewood by the stove. "My mother was. Apache medicine woman before she married my father. I watched her save a dozen lives with dried leaves and prayer. When she died, I kept what I remembered." June nodded, touching a jar of dried sage. "You saved mine." He didn't reply. He only glanced at her long and quiet and returned to his work. By the end of her second week, June could walk the edge of the clearing outside. She stood at the bluff that overlooked the river wind, and her face hair untamed. From behind, Cole watched her, not as a possession, nor as a charge, but as something else entirely. Something beginning. "You still plan on leaving?" he asked, his voice low. June turned. The wind played in her skirt, lifting it like a flag. "I don't know," she admitted. "I came west thinking it would be about escape. Now, I'm not sure it isn't about becoming someone new." Cole nodded. He understood that more than she knew. "Well," he said finally, "until you decide this is your home too." She looked at him for a long time, sunlight catching in her eyes. Then she said, "Thank you. Not just for saving me, for seeing me." That night, as the wind brushed the cabin and the fire burned low, the sound of healing echoed louder than any storm. It wasn't in the crackling of logs or the quiet hum of tea boiling. It was in the shared silence. In the unspoken understanding between two wounded people who'd found not rescue, but recognition in each other. Smoke curled through the tall pines before the flames. It was late summer, and drought had left the underbrush bone dry. June Barrett spotted the glint of orange beyond the ridge while gathering stones by the river's edge. Her heart stuttered. She dropped the stone she'd been cleaning, the sharp edge cutting into her calloused palm. She didn't need to probe the pain to know it was real. June's gaze darted toward Cole Thompson's cabin safe haven until tonight possibly prey. "Cole," her voice cracked across the glassy river. He was already bounding up from below, shovel in hand, dread and adrenaline chasing each other across his face. They met near the cabin door. All around them the forest spat embers, glowing threats that landed in dry moss like sparks of fate. The ridge's pine canopy was already aflame. The fire's roar was distant yet overpowering, like Earth itself was screaming at hurt. Together, they had to decide stay and die or flee and trust. Cole's eyes met June's. The unspoken question passed between them. "Are you ready?" She nodded, wiping sweat and ash from her brow. "We can't leave it undefended," she said, voice raw. "Those supplies, my herbs, everything." Across the clearing, the cabin's walls shimmered in the firelight. His place of refuge, the cradle of her healing. She couldn't just walk away. He didn't flinch. "We can save the medicine room," he said, "but I need your help." Together they raced. June handed him buckets of water from the creek while he soaked burlap door coverings soaked in river water. They soaked everything they could before pulling furniture away from the walls and draping quilts over the stove. Their muscles burned, lungs burned, but they survived. Then a gust of wind, a crack, and a flaming tendril reached the cabin's eaves. June froze. Cole didn't. He grabbed her arm. "Get to the river, then across. I'll draw it out." "But the cabin. I won't leave it to burn us all," he insisted. She looked at him, determined, stubborn, resolute. She couldn't argue. She took one last glance at the place that had saved her and the man who stood beside it, and followed him to the creek. They positioned themselves at the water's edge. Every time he tossed a bucket to douse a hot ember, June dumped hers over the embers, creeping up the opposite bank. Waves of panic crashed through her chest. She wanted him safe. She wanted this to end. The night air was thick with smoke. Eyes watered, lungs burned. And yet they didn't stop. They had learned too much together, trusted too much to falter now. Their hands brushed as they filled buckets, and each knew the other felt it. The silence that no words could fill, the starburst awareness that they were no longer two strangers bound by circumstance, but partners against fire. They worked until their arms trembled, until sunrise tinted the smoke pink, and the blaze began to retreat at the creek's boundary. By dawn, the cabin still stood scarred and blackened, but standing. Cole dropped to his knees on wet earth, exhaustion pressing him to the ground. June fell beside him, silent tears hot against her ash-smudged cheeks. They looked at each other. With that look, everything shifted. Not just relief or triumph, but trust. Not the kind built of words or soft promises, but forged in fire, sweat, fear, and action. The cabin was safe enough. Rain from thunderclouds that rolled in later that morning would finish the rest of the battle. June watched its walls and shook her head. "You saved it." He scooped her close arms wrapped around her shivering form. "We saved it." She let herself lean into him. In that moment, her heart flared brighter than any fire that had tried to destroy them. It wasn't just relief, it was belonging. She felt it deep in her bones, that primal assurance of safety and solidarity. Cleaning and repairs began in the days that followed. Together, they cleared burned debris, patched the roof, restocked firewood, and in that process, they reassembled something even stronger, the promise that their union wasn't temporary. It was intentional. Their cabin wasn't just a refuge from the cold or fire. It had become home. That night, before the wind carried embers away for good, Cole set 2 tin cups at the stove. He poured willow bark tea, same remedy that had steadied her first week, and extended one to June. Her fingers closed around the warm cup, her knuckles still bearing the creek's chill. He smiled, a quiet, steady expression that held more meaning than any declaration. "To us," he said, "to trust made in fire." She raised her cup. "To us." The tea was bitter, but their eyes met over its steam sweet with something more than words could capture. In the wake of flames that threatened to break everything they had found, something unbreakable. Home was not the cabin or the medicine, or even the land itself. It was what they built together. And now they had a foundation strong enough to withstand any blaze life might bring. Cole Thompson paused in the cabin doorway, the late afternoon sun casting his figure into soft relief against the dusty boards. In his hand he held a leather-bound ledger, pages worn from months of careful entries. He took a breath before crossing the threshold, his boots clicking against the wooden floor that June had swept that morning. She looked up from the small desk where she was preparing herbal tinctures, her hands still stained green with yarrow leaves. Whatever he carried wasn't just numbers, it carried promise-weight hesitation. He set the ledger on the table between them. The silence that settled felt deliberate, as if both were measuring the gravity of what Cole was about to say. June met his gaze, steady knowing. She sensed that whatever came next would mark a turning point, her decision poised to shape both their futures. "June," Cole began, voice low but firm. "I've been thinking about what's next. About us, about the cabin, the land, the way we've built something here." He flipped through the ledger, showing her meticulous notes, livestock births, herb yields, income expenses. They painted a picture of steady growth. "Things are changing," he continued, "and I want you to be part of something more permanent." June watched him pulse, quickening. She knew this moment was more than a conversation, it was a crossroad. Cole raised his head. "I've talked to some folks in Silver Creek and Rock Springs. They'd be willing to help us scale up more land for the garden, maybe a small frontier clinic alongside the ranch. They'd invest, but they'd only do that if you stayed June. As my partner. Not a hired hand, not just the woman who tames the cabin chaos. More than anyone else, they want to know you're with me in life, business, everything." He watched her face, searching for reaction. June's heart pounded. A surge of emotion, surprise, pride, fear, hope flooded her. The offer was more than a business proposal. It was an invitation to belong, to shape not just her own future, but theirs together. But what would it cost? Would she be trapped in obligations again? Could she still carry the autonomy she'd fought so fiercely to reclaim? She rose from her chair, steps slow but sure. She set aside the tincture she'd been preparing, wiping her hands on her apron. The afternoon light caught flecks of dust. They floated like tiny sparks of possibility. June steadied herself. "Cole," she said softly, voice clear, "this isn't just money, it's trust. You're trusting that I'll stay because I want to, that you're asking me not out of need but out of respect." He looked away for a moment, swallowing. June continued. "I've found purpose here. I've found us. And maybe I could find more help, more people beyond our cabin walls. But I'll only do it if it's real, if you want me for me. Not just to grow crops or treat cuts, but to build a life." Cole closed his eyes, relief and emotion tugging at his features. He reached across the table, his fingers covering hers. "I want all of it, June. I want you in the livestock pens at dawn, the meetings at Silver Creek, standing by my side, whatever comes next." She let his hand rest there, warm, steady. She looked around the cabin, the rough-hewn walls, the shelf where her tinctures sat next to his tools, the hearth where they shared quiet dinners. This cabin, this land, and this man had built her sense of home. "I choose to stay," she whispered. The weight that had pressed on her chest for years seemed to lift. "Not because I have nowhere else to go, but because here I've found a purpose that fits me, and someone I can lean on." Cole exhaled a soft sound, like wind easing through pine boughs. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small iron key, handmade with a piece of engraved yarrow on its bow. "This is the key to the clinic building at Rock Springs. It's yours as much as it is mine." He handed it to her. June took at her fingers closing around the cool metal. A tear glistened in her eye. Not sadness, but something deeper recognition that her life had changed irrevocably. "Yes," she said again. "I'll stay," and she meant it. For the first time, choice and belonging stood together unbroken. They stood in the cabin's gentle silence, hands clasped. Outside, birds chirped along the ridge unnoticed before. The land seemed alive with expectation. They didn't need grand plans or speeches. Their promise was quiet but unbreakable. They walked out together into that golden light key in her pocket ledger in his hand. The ranch lay beyond pasture and herbal gardens, clinic walls waiting for touch. Whatever storms may come, whatever trials lay ahead, they would face them side by side, partners, equals, grounded in trust. June Barrett, once a woman left behind, had chosen to stay, not because she was rescued, but because she'd found a reason to build, to grow, and to belong. And Cole Thompson, once the solitary rancher, had gained more than a business partner. He'd gained a kindred spirit ready to stand with him in every sunrise and sunset that fate would bring. June Barrett stood at the edge of the garden she and Cole had planted together nearly 3 years ago. Each wooden stake and tangled vine told a story not only of seeds and soil, but of resilience and renewal. Golden light poured over the bending rows of marigold yarrow and sun-ripened squash. The air held the soft hum of bees and the gentle heartbeat of earth finally at peace. But what lay ahead would test everything June had built, her spirit, her partnership with Cole, and the legacy she was cultivating on these western slopes. It began when Cole rode in from Silver Creek one evening, hat in hand, dust swirling around his boots. His eyes carried both triumph and worry. June's heart tightened as he dismounted and handed her a letter stamped with the brand of the Territorial Survey Commission. He watched her face carefully while she read. Inside lay a proposal the map of Horseshoe Bend and surrounding land was being redrawn. A new railroad line would slice through the valley, threatening half their ranch buildings and most of June's garden. They spent that night in the cabin ledger, open candles casting long shadows. They weighed options, begged the surveyors for reroute fight in court or abandon the ranch and take Cole's business elsewhere. But June, fingertips grazing the ledger's balance columns, shook her head. "I can't let them erase this." She pressed a hand to her heart. "This isn't just a garden, it's our roots. It's what we built when no one else believed in us." Cole looked at her with that steady gaze that had seen her through so many storms. He nodded. "Then we fight." And so June became more than a wife and partner. She became an advocate. She rode into Cheyenne with Cole and Tom Bradley, determined to present their case. June spoke before the Survey Commission of soil health, of community benefit, of how her garden served not just the ranch, but local homesteaders feeding families through lean winters. She spoke of biodiversity, of medicinal herb diversity, weaving statistics and stories with a confident, humble eloquence. It wasn't easy. The railroad folks shrugged, citing profit and engineering. But June showed them the ledger of clients, neighboring settlers who'd come for tinctures, clinic referrals from Tripler's Clinic, orders for seeds. She spoke of Cole's planned clinic expansion, of the surge in employment. She reminded them that the land was more than lines on a map, it was lifeblood. Days turned into weeks. The surveyors measured and circled, recalculated and retreated. June and Cole paced through the greenhouse June had built herself, where tomatoes and peppers stretched toward the skylight, proof of what careful hands could nurture. They planted seedlings, walked fences, met with land agents. She watched Cole when he was quiet, breath slow but hopeful, her partner trusting her guidance. Then, on a morning when frost still clung to the edges of leaves, word arrived the Railroad Commission had rerouted. The line would arc north of the property, curving gently around the established garden and ranch buildings. The announcement came with maps, signatures, and relief. But for June, it was more than a victory over a government decree. It was affirmation of her vision of her voice, finally heard in a world that had once told her to stay silent. That afternoon, they walked through the greenhouse, hands clasped. June picked a ripe tomato, its skin warm and firm. She handed it to Cole, who tasted it and smiled as juices stained his chin. She laughed at how careful he was not to ruin his shirt. In that laughter was relief, pride, and love. The garden at Horseshoe Bend grew into something legendary. June expanded into experimental rows, heirloom grains, medicinal echinacea, pollinator corridors. Ranch hands learned planting seasons beside their livestock duties. Neighbors brought their children to learn grafting, tincture making, sustainable cultivation. June's herbal remedies became sought as far as Casper. Surveys credited her garden as a model for sustainable Western agriculture inclusion in local textbooks. She had changed the map in more ways than one. Cole watched her often from the doorway of her greenhouse. He saw how she greeted newcomers with quiet warmth, how she taught Tom's wife, Martha, to brew rosemary tea for sore throats, how she saved a calf with poultice when the vet couldn't reach them in a blizzard. He saw how the garden fed not just bodies but spirits. One dusk, they stood on the ridge overlooking the valley garden below, ranch stretching west, railroad line arcing beyond. The setting sun lit the rails in copper glow. June slipped her hand into Cole's. "You changed too," she said softly. "You believed?" He pulled her close. "No," he said. "You changed the map. Not the lines on paper, but all of this." He swept a gesture over the valley, the smoke rising gently from the clinic's chimney, the lantern lights in Tom's cabin, the faint whistle of a train heading north. "You changed how we see ourselves." Tears came, but June smiled no longer. The quiet woman left behind in the wind but a founder-leader partner. She had drawn maps not just on paper, but on hearts and futures. They walked back toward home, steps steady in the warm twilight. The bees hummed in the garden, crickets began their evening songs, and Horseshoe Bend held its breath in the golden haze. June Barrett, the woman who changed the map, had made this land hers, and through conviction, compassion, and courage, she had made it something greater than any boundary could confine. Sunlight bathed Horseshoe Bend in warm gold, as June Barrett stepped into the greenhouse, her fingers trailing over rows of marigolds and elderflowers. She felt the familiar hush of growth and purpose until she noticed the broken glass at her feet. Heart pounding, she followed the splintered shard toward the back corner where blossoming echinacea lay crushed under a heavy wooden frame. April rains had weakened the structure, causing the shelving unit to tilt and collapse. But this wasn't an accident. Among the wreckage lay muddy footprints leading out through the open door, well-worn leather boot prints intimately familiar, Tom Bradley's. June's breath caught. Tom, her trusted foreman, had never shown anything but respect and loyalty. She swallowed hard, mind racing. Had Tom meant harm? Was it jealousy, sabotage, fear of the garden's growing influence? Everything they'd built could be undone in a single night, and the line between trust and doubt rattled. June wiped away dread and went searching. She found Tom at twilight kneeling beside a fallen fence panel separating the garden from pasture. Next to him lay a damaged wheelbarrow gears, rusted and bent. He looked up, surprise and guilt flickering across his face. "June," he said softly, "I didn't mean to break things." June crossed her arms, voice trembling. "You did it, didn't you, Tom, in the night?" He hesitated, gaze torn, then he nodded. "I was scared. The railroad's expansion could bring too much change. We're a good crew because we're trusted. I thought if the garden collapsed first, the railroad might you'd have to leave the ranch would fall back to basics. I was protecting my job for all of us. By destroying our work," June's voice cracked, pain and shock overtaking her. You nearly destroyed this entire operation. This garden feeds people, connects us to the community, everything we stood for. Tom hung his head. I know, and I'm sorry. I was wrong. I was acting out of fear. Silence settled over the clearing. June's hands shook. She thought of seedlings she'd carefully nurtured, wounded cattle she'd nursed, trust she'd placed in this team. Now that trust lay broken in fragments. Tell me, she said quietly, if this was about the railroad, did you tell anyone? Are they behind it? Tom shook his head. No, I acted alone. I don't trust them, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. I thought I'd fix it before anyone noticed, but I couldn't. June's chest tightened, not just at the betrayal, but the loneliness of leadership. She realized reaching this point meant not just technical skill, but emotional courage. You need to trust me, she said softer. Trust builds this garden, but trust is fragile. Tears spilled from Tom's eyes. June, I do trust you. I just felt outside this. You and him, you've built so much I couldn't touch. That word, touch, struck June. It echoed the fear she sometimes felt among her team that her presence, her vision might be intimidating, distant, gendered apart. She knelt and looked Tom in the face. You're part of this garden. You always have been since the day you helped me move supplies into the cabin. But I never asked how you felt. I was too focused on the end result, not the people who made it possible. He squeezed her hand. I want to help fix it. June rose fierce and determined. Then we fix it. Now. Under a sky heavy with dusk, they moved row by row, salvaging roots, staking broken stems, salvaging what they could. June barked silent encouragement. Hold steady, that one's all right, we'll replant in the morning. Tom worked beside her, sweat and dirt, mixing with tears of relief, harvest helpers gathering to assist, united once more. As dawn broke the next day, the greenhouse was marked by fresh stakes and cleared rubble. But elsewhere on the ranch, a different crisis unfolded. Cole appeared riding hard. June and Tom looked up as he galloped in hair and coat, dust-caked fear etched on his face. The railroad surveyors are here with men and measuring tools. They're planning to lay track directly through the main water pipeline, feeding the garden, and worse. They've filed claims on that cabin of ours, calling it unpermitted construction. June's breath stopped. They had won the map rerouting, but had the railroad company appealed, ignoring local committees? Had the sabotage by one of her own been used as leverage to challenge their legitimacy? Cole, dismounted, voice urgent. They've posted notices, pull it up, or we risk injunctions and fines. They're coming tomorrow at first light. June's stomach lurched, blood pounding with fear and resolution. This was not just sabotage, it was escalation. A corporate institution threatening the heart of what they had built. The stakes were no longer petals and seedlings, but legal ownership, community roots, survival. She turned to Tom, who met her gaze with determination. We need every person on the ranch, Tom said. I'll call the men. June nodded. And I'll speak again tonight at the town hall meeting. We'll call on Cheyenne residents to stand with us. Within hours, the ranch team mobilized musicians with guitars, women to bring hot cider voices, to share how the garden had changed lives, stories of healing, Thanksgiving seed sharing, and community bonding. Even ranch hands, who'd once been wary of outsider ideals, stepped forward. That evening, at the Cheyenne Town Hall, June stood before a packed audience. Candlelight flickered across faces old and young. She described the sabotage not to shame Tom, but to humanize their struggle, to show the stakes of disconnection when fear overrides unity. She laid out the facts. Water pipeline, essential cabin, permitted decades ago, under territorial authority, community demand for local agriculture, healing arts, sustainable food. She spoke of the human cost of profit-driven cut-throughs and the promise of a shared future built on respect and integrity. A hush fell. Shepherds, merchants, ranchers, teachers all emerged to back them petitions, signed letters, drafted declarations supporting a small garden that became a communal cornerstone. The next morning dawned crisp, the sound of surveyor drills echoing from the embankment. But as Horseshoe Bend stirred, a procession of townsfolk arrived, led by the mayor local judge and 5 ranch hands carrying the restored pipeline parts and lumber boards to reinforce the cabin. The surveying party watched as line upon line of people rose to defend this place. June, Cole, and Tom stood together under that iconic pine knoll flanked by ranch hands, Tom in his rough coat and June holding a soil sample and a seed packet. The lead surveyor approached, papers in hand. The mayor stepped forward. "Miss Barrett," he began, "this is a territory that honors roots literal and heartfelt. I've reviewed your permits. The cabin is lawful, the water right established. Any rerouting must proceed through proper channels. These people are with you." The surveyor's jaw clenched as murmurs spread through the crowd. After a moment of tense silence, he nodded. "We'll comply." A collective cheer rose. June's knees buckled, and she sank to the earth, tears streaming as relief and triumph collided within her. Cole caught her lifting her as the crowd surged around, Tom catching her hand with gratitude. That afternoon, they spent hours fixing the pipeline, reinforcing cabin supports, planting replacement seedlings. Each shovel of soil carried unity. Each plank driven into the frame whispered resilience. They built not just a stronger garden, but a stronger community. When evening fell, they gathered for a simple feast under the greenhouse skylight. The cabbages and squash from last season's harvest cooked into a stew seasoned by community and love. Cole toasted. To the woman who changed maps, but tonight, who built a map of trust rooted right here. June smiled through tears. To all who stood with us. She looked at Tom. "Your doubt led us to strengthen our foundation. I forgive you, and I thank you for bringing us back together." Tom nodded, voice thick. "We all needed reminding. Fear can destroy, but unity can build." As lantern light glowed around her, June Barrett felt the pulse of something greater than harvest, something perfect and raw belonging. And she whispered to the circle of faces, "Together we'll keep creating." If this story moved your heart and sparked your spirit, please subscribe to our channel and ring the bell so we can bring even more stories of courage, resilience, and unexpected triumph. Your support helps us continue weaving tales that remind us. Sometimes one garden, one voice can change the entire map.